All right, it is 4:30 and I'm calling the meeting to order. I'd like to acknowledge that the District of Tofino operates within the territory of the Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation. Notice to attendees that the meeting is being video recorded and will be published on the District of Tofino's YouTube channel. Notice to virtual attendees to sign up for public comment and question period using the Q&A function in Zoom. To register, participants are required to enter their full name, residential address, and the agenda item they wish to speak to. Through unanimous consent, if there are no objections, I move that pursuant to section 15 of the District of Tofino Meeting Procedure Bylaw number 1229/2016 as amended, the September 12th, 2023 regular meeting be held electronically via Zoom and live broadcasted on the District of Tofino's YouTube channel. And that the facility provided for the public to watch and hear the meeting be located at Municipal Hall, 380 Campbell Street in Tofino, BC. Seeing no objections, the motion is carried. Also, through unanimous consent, I move that the September 12th, 2023 regular council agenda be adopted. Seeing no objections, motion is carried. All right, consent agenda. You go. Through unanimous consent, if there are no objections, I move that items 4.1 and 4.2 of the consent agenda of the regular council meeting held September 12th, 2023 be approved and received. Any objections? Seeing no objections from council, that motion is carried. Adoption of minutes. So I move that the stage 4 water restrictions and emergency plan be approved as amended and the committee recommends approval of the plan. Objections. And that the minutes of the emergency program executive committee meeting. Sorry.
The recommendations have to be read separately.
Oh, okay.
I just want to clarify for council that we had them in the reverse order. So the recommendations on the committee minutes will be read first, and then the recommendation approving the minutes of the committee will be read second.
Okay, thanks. All right, I'll start over then. So I move that the stage 4 water restrictions and emergency plan be approved as amended and the committee recommends approval of the plan. Second, Councillor Thomas. All in favor? Approved. And I move that the minutes of the emergency program executive committee meeting held September 5th, 2023 be adopted. Second, Thomas. All in favor? Approved. Right, item 5.2. I move that the minutes of the Public Art Advisory Committee held August 19th, 2023 be adopted.
Second.
Seconded by Anderson. All in favor? Approved. Item 5.3. Minutes of the Public Art Advisory Committee held June 28th, 2023. Be adopted. All in favor? Or sorry, seconder.
I'll second.
Anderson, all in favor. And 5.4. The backwards one. So I move that the Recreation Advisory Committee recommends the allocation of the Tofino Recreation Commission funds as follows. $41,038.19 of the Tofino Recreation Commission general account be allocated to the Kids Access Fund. $13,679.39 of the Tofino Recreation Commission general account be allocated for community recreation promotion through the annual council grant program. And $3,717.28 of the Tofino Recreation Commission Raymond Holtz account be allocated to the recreation operating budget to be used for a safe bike program and parade annually. Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Just point of order, was the
Right.
minutes, were they, I might have missed that,
That was,
of the recreation
So-
advisory committee?
we're having to read that one first because it is a amendment, and then that is the amendment in the minutes, and then we're approving the minutes after.
Roger.
May I
Or,
may further clarify? So when there are recommendations in the committee minutes, those recommendations are pulled out and they have to be approved by council before the minutes are approved. So it's not an amendment to the minutes. It's read just as it was in the minutes from the committee. Thank you.
all right. I move that the minutes of the Recreation Advisory Committee held August 9th, 2023 be adopted. Second, Thomas, all in favor? Approved. All right. Public comments, Mr. Shortall, do we have public comments on agenda items?
Thank you, Acting Mayor Sawyer. Currently, there's no comments from the public, but I'll make a call for anyone in attendance here in council chambers or attending via Zoom would like to make a comment to council. They can do so now by using the question and answer function on Zoom. You state your name, your address, and the agenda item you're speaking to. So calling 3 times, calling once, calling twice, calling 3 times, and no comments at this point.
All right, thank you. So next up, we have the mayor's report, who is not here today, so I do not have anything to present. And next up, delegations.
No delegation.
No delegations. And 9, correspondence. Guessing everyone read the letters. Any comments? McMaster?
I'd like to, through the chair, I'd like to just ask staff about item 9.1 and this idea of introducing a new classification for short-term rentals. Because we've always heard about downzoning, but this is the first time I've heard someone mention that we actually can introduce a new class. Is that true or not, or is it just wishful thinking?
Through the chair to Councillor McMaster, thank you for the question. It's not possible for the local government to do so. This would take definitely lobbying to the province for us to make this happen. If council would like staff to respond in any way to the letter in particular, we can certainly take your direction on that. Otherwise, I presume we'll likely speak about this in preparation for 2024 UBCM.
I'd like to see a response because I think the letter leads everyone to believe that we have the power to do that. And I agree with exactly what you said. So that's why I was surprised. So I would like to see a response to just explain to the people what power we actually do have.
Anderson?
Yeah, I would have like also to add to that response that we did go to BC assessment last year at UBCM and presented, and we're trying to seek their assistance in finding a way of creating a new class to deal with short-term rentals so that they could be taxed separately or independently or differently than other residential property that isn't so commercially oriented. in terms of short-term rental property. So we have made efforts in the past, and also I think the response should include maybe reference to some of the UBCM resolutions that have been passed on the floor at UBCM in the past, when other municipalities that I believe have brought forward resolutions also seeking that separate class. So there has been action in the past at UBCM in terms of lobbying, not only from Tofino, but from other municipalities. And the letter seems to imply that question hasn't been pursued at all. Yeah, so that's something also that could be included in the response.
All right, any other thoughts? Councillor Steer?
No, it'll be in the next meeting. One.
Okay. All right, so then I'm hearing interest.
Need a resolution for that?
Yeah, or can we
No,
just,
that's okay. Staff will submit a standard response, but we'll include a bit more content in this one.
okay,
Thank you.
thank you. All right. Next item of correspondence, 9.2, the Tla-o-qui-aht Regional District Transportation Advisory Committee. Everyone have a chance to read that?
Yeah, thank you through the chair. Yeah, one of the requests in there is for an appointment to the advisory committee, and I talked to Mayor Law in the past around this issue, and I would suggest he would be the appropriate person to sit on that committee through the NCRD. And I don't know if we need to talk to Mayor Law about that in person. I have had conversation with him.
Okay. Yeah, I would not be sure if we can appoint a council member without them being present.
If I may, through the chair, we can appoint Mayor Law in his absence. I do know that council is aware, we signed a joint letter very recently to talk about an alternative route to the West Coast, and Mayor Law has been part of those discussions outside of council meetings. So I think it would be appropriate to appoint Mayor Law, and if there's any concerns, we can bring it back to a future council meeting.
All right. Then in that case, I move that Mayor Law be appointed to sit on the Transportation Advisory Committee for the Tla-o-qui-aht Regional District.
Second.
Second by Steer, all in favor? Unanimous. Okay. Brings us to presentations and reports. First up, Mr. Aaron Roberts.
This is for the water.
Yes, sorry, water update,
Thank you.
verbal report from Infrastructure and Public Works.
Thanks so much. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I just have the Mayor indicated a verbal report today. It's gonna be a little bit of a background of what happened over the last 10 days in terms of our water system, what stages we're at, and a little bit about what the changes we made to our infrastructure over the last week. So about 10 days ago, last Friday, we observed that our osmosis reservoir was at historically low levels. Our operators had never seen it that low. We were seeing increasing demand on the system as we moved into the long weekend, and the weather forecast didn't look great at that point. And so at that time, we began prepping for potential stage 4 the following week. Through that process, our public works infrastructure staff continued to work to look at what other options we could have if we moved into stage 4 and make sure we'd have enough water for the town. And they came up with an idea that they wanted to test out. In the meantime, the weather change, we started getting a better weather forecast, and the things started to look favorable to the end of that week. So the infrastructure upgrade that we undertook on Mears Island basically connects 2 water systems on the Bay Street side of the system. So on the high pressure side of the system, the Bay Street, we have 3 creeks feeding our reservoirs. We have Sharp Creek and Number One Creek, which supply the Sharp Creek Dam. And then we have Close Creek and sort of Mears Creek, but mostly Close Creek that supplies our Bay Street tank, the Close Creek tank. What we did was connect those 2 reservoirs on Mears Island. So that was a fix. So it came up with our folks came up with it on the Friday. They came in over the long weekend and fabricated it, glued it up, got it ready to go, put it in place on the Tuesday following the long weekend, where we tested it and proof of concept worked. We could move water from Sharp Dam, which holds 2,000 cubic meters, to our Bay Street tank, which only holds 500 cubic meters. And in doing so, allowing us to, we think, store water in that side of the system. So water that was previously overflowing the dam was now being directed into the Bay Street, side. On the other side of the ocean, on the peninsula side, we then adjusted our operations to pull more water from the Bay Street side, to grab that water that we collected and move it into the south side of the district to support the Acmossus Reservoir, allowing us to turn the Acmossus Reservoir off and then turn it back on, but with reduced flow, which allowed at that time the reservoir to stop dropping and stabilize. There was still a lot of moving back and forth of water. The Close Creek tank doesn't have a lot of storage, so we're moving water on an hour-to-hour basis. So with that happening, allowed us to hold off the stage 4. We got the better forecast, which obviously showed up the last couple of days. And since then, we've seen a pretty significant turnaround in the system, as one would expect with this rain. What exactly is happening at the Bay Street side and the Close Creek tank and the Sharp Dam needs more work. We need to understand how much water is moving, how much we can store, what that exactly means for our operations on this side. And that's work that's going to continue over the winter time. Our engineers are involved. They were involved in reviewing the concept that our operators came up with. Now we're going to get into details about what exactly is happening there and how we can use that to support our infrastructure in the future. One of the early initial upgrades that will come out of this is we're going to be replacing that piping that we developed a bypass on, which has been in the ground for 40 or 50 years, which is leaking and not in great condition. We're probably most likely to be replacing that in the next 2 to 3 months, including adding meters so we can start determining how much flow is moving back and forth. Just make sure I haven't missed anything here. We had Northwest Hydraulics here as well last Thursday, so we were able to record the flows at their lowest. We think maybe a 1 in 75 or 1 in 100 year event. So we'll have more data on our source creek flows in a significant drought. Based on the fact that Acmossus levels are increasing. So from Friday, we were about 24 inches below the sill. We're now up to about 17 or 18 today. I'm watching that pretty much an hourly basis, and it's slowly coming out. This rain will help it to show up in the next 24 or 48 hours. And so we can start thinking about potentially rolling back stage 3 in the coming week. I don't want to say to do it now. We're into 5 days of what we would expect to be lower usage because we're during the week. We're moving into later September, but there's a good chance that we can roll back from stage 3 or stage 2 or even stage 1 sometime next week, but we'll just sort of leave that aside. So yeah, a lot of the work to do will be optimizing what's happening. We're going to be wanting to understand how exactly we operate in terms of at what level we operate Acmossus in a water shortage, what level we operate our Bay Street pumps, what does that mean in terms of infrastructure? Are we running our pumps longer? Can they take it? All those types of questions have yet to be answered. Does this mean we focus more on the Bay Street side of the system into the future, understanding that even though it has less storage, it is a producer of water? So just for council's information, even at the height of this drought, there was still water flowing over the Sharp Dam, saying that Sharp Creek was still producing a significant at the driest we've ever been since probably sometime in the 50s, which is good news. Yeah, I think that's it for my update. I have a really interesting diagram I drew. I haven't, since this is verb, I can't really show it to you, but if you ever want, I can sit down, I'll explain to you how I understand it. And hopefully by this time next year, this time 6 months from now, we'll have an engineered version of that with accurate numbers and better drawn arrows. Happy to take any questions. Again.
All right, any comments, questions?
Yeah.
Councillor Sawyer?
Well, I was just wondering, when you did this diverter, was there still water flowing over the dam or?
Yes.
And I guess my question would be like, how does that affect like the wildlife below? Is that a salmon bearing creek or?
I don't actually know the details of that. We are allowed to pull a certain amount of water from that from those drainages, and we're still within those limits. So we checked into our licenses, and so we haven't pulled out any more than we were allowed to pull out. So I can't say what the impacts are downstream other than we have permission to pull that water. We haven't done the environmental. We, as this group, has done the environmental report. Not to say that there hasn't been one done in the past.
And then I just wanted to say thank you because I know everyone was so worried.
Yeah, I think I can echo that. It's really refreshing to get good news.
I just have a quick comment. I was at a mermaid themed birthday party, and one of those operators who came up with the idea showed me the pictures, and I just really wanted to thank staff for their innovation and the work that they did on that. It really was a collaborative effort at the very ground level. It goes without saying how impressive that was, and then to have the engineers give the old check mark on just reinforces the fact that we have some pretty dedicated and bright staff in that area. So thank you once again.
Anyone else? All right,
I have one final word to say.
yeah,
I, as the Director of Instructional Public Works, just want to thank council and community for supporting the infrastructure team and public works team over the last year in terms of adding new staff. I don't think this happens if our staff don't have the time to think about these things. So for many years, we've been chasing our tails, fixing water main breaks, and the ability for a full infrastructure and asset management team to work with operators who have time to talk this out is I think is probably why this happened now and hasn't happened in the past. And I just want to say thank you for the resources that we have now in infrastructure and public works.
thank you very much. Next up, we have item 10.2, Arts, Culture and Heritage Grant Policy and Event Support Grant Policy Review, report from Community Services. Hutchinson, hello.
Hello, good evening, Acting Mayor and Council. So I'm just gonna give you I will wait until I'm queued up. Here we go. Awesome, thank you. So I'm presenting on the Arts, Culture and Heritage Grant and Event Support Grant Policy Review. Quick little background. So there's two grant programs that I'm going to speak about today, and that is the Arts, Culture and Heritage Grant Program. So that program was established in July 2010, and it supports programs, projects that support a culturally engaged community and artful public realm that contributes to the quality of life in Tofino. This grant program is funded through taxation, and the current annual budget is $25,000, and that has been the budget since 2013 when it was established. The Event Support Grant Program was established on August 2013, and it supports events that contribute to visitor experience, increased non-peak visitation, length of stay, and return trips. This grant program is funded through the district's participation in the Resort Municipality Initiative Program. And the current annual budget is $25,000, and that was increased from $20,000 just last year. Before that, all the way back to 2014, that was $20,000 annually. So in the spring of 2023, staff held a collaborative arts and culture roundtable that was facilitated by Mo Douglas. This was an action item that came out of the Arts and Culture Master Plan. From this roundtable, there were three main areas that emerged through conversation with the sector. One was concerns regarding oversubscription of the grant programs the district offers. And so prior to, actually for most years, both of these grants have been oversubscribed. Arts and culture has been oversubscribed 9 out of the 11 years that we've offered it. And the event support program has been oversubscribed 9 out of the 10 years that we've offered it. Funding is often used by organizations to leverage larger amounts from funders. And this demonstrates to other funders that they have community support for their projects. So this is a very important grant funding source for most organizations on the coast. The second area that emerged was new versus existing events, programs, and projects. And so from the discussion, it is often easier to seek funding for new projects from organizations' perspective than maintaining existing programs and events. And at times it's detrimental to beloved community events that are often in their 3rd, 5th, or multiple years down the road. Because it becomes increasingly challenging to grow with the community on those events. And based on discussion at the Arts and Culture Roundtable, the sector would like to preserve character and cultural activities while still allowing for new ideas and growth in the sector. And the last area of discussion that emerged related to the grants was around the amount awarded versus application time, and also inflationary considerations. As noted earlier, those funding budget amounts have not really changed much since they were established. Applications are typically coming from volunteer nonprofit organizations, and at times the effort and the time it takes to apply can be administratively heavy for those groups versus the impact that funding may have on those programs and projects. There we go. So given the feedback collected that staff collected at the Arts and Culture Roundtable, staff are recommending to council to refer this feedback to the Each Advisory Committee. The Each Advisory Committee, just so everyone's aware, is the Events, Arts, Culture, and Heritage Advisory Committee. And this does align with the committee's terms of reference, as noted just at the bottom, that bullet point, so they can comment on and advising council and staff regarding arts, culture, and heritage grant or event support grant processes and policies. So tonight, the recommendation before you is that the report titled Arts, Culture, and Heritage Grant Policy and Event Support Grant Policy Review be referred to the Each Advisory Committee to advise on recommended revisions to the Event Support Grant Policy and the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Grant Policy.
All right, thank you very much.
Question?
Any questions from council?
We talk about the programs that are always oversubscribed. Don't you think that would be the case, whatever the amount of money was? Have we ever been under?
Well, I can tell you through the chair. So for the arts and culture, typically the oversubscription has ranged anywhere from 3,200 all the way up to 20,000. That's kind of the range. The event support grant, however, that oversubscription range has been anywhere from 12,500 all the way up to 53,000, which we know some people like to ask for very large grants, which isn't necessarily the reason we're doing these, but that just kind of gives you the breadth of what people have asked for in the past.
Okay, and then the comment I would add would be that, you know, when I've been on council, it was always viewed that, you know, events that have been around a long time should start to become self-sufficient, self-sustaining, and that's why we favoured new events. So that's going to change.
Yeah, through the mayor. I think it gets really expensive to run events. Just speaking from as a former event producer. So Yeah, I think that's just a really hard to expect them to make money to provide their own support in the long term isn't always necessarily the case. You hope that you can, you know, break even as an event, but it's also a lot of work and really expensive, especially given that costs are increasing year over year.
If I can follow up on Councillor McMaster's comment. Reading the report, I did see that note on the newer events having more ease finding funding. And it didn't make sense to me at first until I also did remember that, as far as I know, quite a few of our events are not for profit. And so it is hard for them to gain funds, sustain themselves for the following year. Is that right?
Many events are not for profit, or they're organized and ran by not for profit organizations. So finding funding sources can be tricky.
It's a requirement.
It is a requirement of
Yes.
programs, yes.
Yeah.
May I follow up on that? So I was at the round table, and from what I understood was a lot of the events that are coming back, it's like they do try and get funding from other areas, but like funding from the municipal level is almost like the beginning stepping stone for them to even get looked at by these other funding options. And so for them, they really felt like because they're a successful event and they're part of our community, it doesn't always feel like they're being, like they feel like they're being punished because they've been successful. And I don't know, that's what I heard there.
Okay, thank you. And sorry, Councillor Stewart.
Just a quick question through the mayor. Is there a maximum amount per grant application that we have for this particular sector?
Sure, through the mayor. So currently both grants are set at a maximum application amount of 2,500. And that just helps us balance the requests.
Thank you very much. Any further comments or questions?
Maybe, well, I don't have any questions, but if we're going to move to the comments and discussion, maybe we should let staff members take a seat.
Yeah.
I can move the recommendation that the report titled Arts, Culture and Heritage Grant Policy and Event Support Grant Policy Review be referred to the Events, Arts, Culture and Heritage Advisory Committee to advise and recommended revisions to the Event Support Grant Policy and Arts, Culture and Heritage Grant Policy.
Seconded, all in favor?
If I may, Chair Sawyer, with all due respect, when after the motion is seconded, just to call for discussion before showing that everyone's in favor, particularly for some of the items coming up later in the agenda, there may be discussion before the motion is passed.
Okay, thank you. I will do that. Speaking of further items, we have 10.3. The Enterprise Fleet Management Program Report from Infrastructure and Public Works.
Good evening once again, Mayor and Council. I'm going to present a short presentation on the enterprise program, fleet leasing. There's be a fair amount more information within the report in front of council. So a little bit of background as we've begun to understand our budget at Public Works with the new team we have there. We want to move forward in formalizing our fleet management process. As part of this process, we've decided that Public Works will be the lead department for the district, which is sort of how it's happened in the past, but not really formalized. We're making sure that Public Works will be now managing the fleet for the entire department, the entire district. This fits into our asset management plan and asset management planning processes. Fleet is, a fairly large part of the budget. It needs a little bit more attention than it had in the past. And to undertake this work sooner rather than later, we propose to work with a third-party consultant in this aspect of this enterprise, and we've ended up with enterprise through the new procurement framework, which is a framework that allows municipalities to receive preferred pricing and avoid having to go through lengthy procurement processes for certain services and items. So the financial impact of this, we believe that we will see some savings through this process. We definitely see a little bit more financial stability on the year-to-year budgeting in terms of fleet. We believe, again, there'll be a net potential of capital savings, and we believe we will also have reduced district time to manage the fleet as we turn over vehicles more often, resulting in less maintenance and driving to Port Alberni and back to maintain those vehicles. There are two major objectives within this proposal. One is to identify an effective vehicle life cycle that maximizes potential equity at time of resale. So we hope to shorten our vehicle life cycle in about half. Again, have a lower and predictable sustainable fleet cost, reduce our average monthly vehicle maintenance by about 2/3. Reduce fuel costs as we get into more fuel efficient vehicles and the ability to potentially move to electric vehicles in the near future. And finally, leverage an open-ended lease to maximize cash flow opportunities and recognize equity. Objective 2 would be to increase employee safety of new vehicles. So we have a fleet that is fairly old. We have 2 vehicles that don't have anti-lock brakes. We have 3 vehicles that don't have electronic stability control, which is a fairly significant safety improvement. And then majority of our vehicles don't have backup cameras. A couple of other points for council's consideration. We would like to move this forward in September, so we can accommodate the purchase of a vehicle to replace our Unit 2, which is our dump truck, and allow us to have a fully operational snow plow and sanding system for this winter. There's some leasing advantages in terms of cash flow, and obviously said reduced maintenance costs. We don't believe this will result in much change, if any, to our day-to-day operations. And in moving forward with enterprise, we have the ability to track data a little bit better than we have in the past, as well as have access to advanced vehicle management technology if we decide to move in that direction. So the recommendation is that staff be authorized to execute a master equity vehicle lease agreement with Enterprise Fleet Management Canada Incorporated upon approval to manage the district's fleet of light and medium duty vehicles. If there are any questions related to some parts of this, particularly asset management parts, I can answer. If we get into leasing versus purchasing, I may have to ask my colleagues, Sao, Atiana, or Ms. Bodnar to help me with those questions.
All right, thank you very much. Start out with Councillor Steer.
Thank you for that. And you know, through the objectives, the 2 big things, savings and safety, excellent objectives. And I'm just wondering, under this savings component of it in the objectives, if there's any potential for a reduction and or multitasking within, I think it's about 15 was the number that was indicated in the report. And I'm just, if that, I didn't see it included in potentially in that objective number 1 in terms of potential cost savings and the ability to multitask a vehicle, or in fact to be able to reduce that fleet if in fact that is something that could be done.
Thank you.
And I think I know the answer, Mr. Rogers, but
yeah, it's a great question. I don't believe there are opportunities for us to optimize how we use our vehicles, but it's more likely on the district operational side than it will be on the enterprise side. If I had to forecast for a couple of years, I would imagine our fleets can get larger. Some of the what we're looking at as maybe one way to solve this is looking at tow-on beds. So where we have some chassis that can accommodate many different types of beds. So perhaps instead of having a water and a sewer truck, maybe you can have a truck that has a water and sewer box. It only takes apparently 30 seconds to a minute to transfer boxes. So that's something we will look to. That's something that we probably have to, investigate, but definitely within the enterprise program, they supply vehicles like that. So that's one of the ways we're looking at maybe doing a little bit of what you're speaking to. But yeah, with our, with the wastewater treatment plant coming on board and different staffing levels, even today I had my facilities maintenance lead come to me and say, can I borrow the Prius because all the trucks have been used. So we'll do the best we can, but yeah, I'm not sure.
Thank you. Councillor Anderson?
Yeah, I know that in the past, there's been some objectives or maybe direction from council to pursue some electric vehicles for public works. And I don't know if we ever established a policy around that or not. So that's one question, whether we have a policy and whether we move to this, if we can still move towards some of those objectives to green up the fleet, so to speak. And also I see the shorter lifespans of a vehicle allow us to move that along as the world changes to more electric vehicles. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, particularly whether or not we have a policy and if entering into this will comply with that policy.
Thanks for the question. I'm not aware of any overt policy. I think I remember similar conversations at the council table and with the staff, and we've moved towards hybrid vehicles with larger vehicles to try to bridge that gap between the electric vehicles fully coming on board. I think the market's still maturing in terms of what we can get in terms of electric vehicles, but it would be front and center for us to move fully into electric at some point. Just like looking at our fuel bills on in our fleet, the cost of fuel is very, very high, and I don't think it's getting less. So I think working with enterprise, we're going to be meeting with them 2 or 3 times a year to sort of do strategic plan about what we're doing and start identifying when and what type of vehicles we may be able to switch over to electric. And the other piece that we would have to consider, and it's a big conversation with enterprise in terms of timing, but making sure that we have the required infrastructure at the public works yard to charge overnight for that many vehicles. So if we had 50 vehicles charging overnight, we'd want to have, we'd most likely have to upgrade our current electrical facilities, we'll build a facility. And part of that is also tied into the BC Hydro completing their upgrades to the overall system. So I think the ability of us replacing, to your point, replacing them quite often in terms of every 4 years, we'll be able to do this quite quickly as soon as we've got the pieces in place. And in the meantime, hybrids if we can.
And then I had another question. We've sort of identified enterprise fleet management. Are they the only game in town? I'm just wondering why there wasn't maybe a competitive process to award this contract.
It's a great question. There was a competitive process. It was almost invisible to us. So we learned about the new procurement framework earlier this year or late last year. And it's a process that a framework that, or a company or a service that began in Alberta, I think what 20 or 30 years ago. And it was a bunch of group of municipalities getting together to get better pricing on certain items. That's since that time expanded across the country. And so they do the procurement on their side. So they do the competitive pricing to find the best costs. And then they literally have basically like a catalog. You can go through and go tires or fire trucks or services like parking, and they've already done all the procurement work. So we're getting the best value for dollar there. And that meets the other requirements that we have under the various purchasing legislations. And so it was a competitive process, but just undertaken by community procurement, and we can just have the benefit of picking it off the shelf. So we didn't do any comparisons because of that.
Great, thanks.
All right. I've got just a question for clarification, if that's all right, just so I can understand. So there's, the stated savings in maintenance. And then you mentioned not having to drive to Port Alberni, but as far as I'm aware, does Enterprise, how would that work? Would they be maintaining vehicles here, or would they just send a new vehicle and swap out? How would that work?
Great question. So currently, when a vehicle requires certain types of maintenance, that can't be accommodated at the local mechanics. So we'll all look whatever we can, just in terms of timing for us and also supporting local business. But for certain things we have to go to town, we just do the annual maintenance or something significant. And we will go to, right now we have a wide variety of vehicles. We have Toyotas, we have Fords, we still may have a Dodge. And so we're going to different mechanics and different shops for that. As we move through this process, we'll start to standardize our fleet to whatever makes the most sense, whether, I don't know what type it'll be, but it'll be some types of say it's Fords. And we're within this framework, we can dictate to enterprise where we want those cars taken. So if we had a previous relationship with a garage, that would be the area. Enterprise would say you're due for your 6,000 kilometer check or your annual, it needs to be in at that time. We drive in, drop it off, bring it back. They would take care of all the paperwork. So we're still going to be going into town to Port Alberni with our staff to drive and drop off vehicles, but perhaps we can do it in a way that we're dropping, picking. So we're not sending two staff, two vehicles to get people home. So there'll be a little bit more organization on that side. And then because the vehicles are newer, we expect to be there less because we're maintaining them on a regular basis and we're getting vehicles that is sooner. So that's what I meant in terms of potentially saving some driving.
No, that's great. Thank you. I was interested in that. All right, any further questions? Anyone like to read the recommendation?
I'll read it. I move that staff be authorized to execute a master equity vehicle lease agreement with Enterprise Fleet Management Canada Incorporated upon approval to manage the district's fleet of light and medium duty vehicles.
Okay.
Seconded by Master. Any further comments? All in favor? All right. Next up, item 10.4, the impact assessment of removing paid advertisements from Meta. Report from corporate services. Mr. McCall.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you very much. So I'm here tonight to present a presentation to you about the impact assessment of removing paid ads from Meta. So a bit of background here. On June 22nd, Bill C-18 required digital platforms, including Meta, to pay news organizations for posting links on their products. So as Meta, many of you know, owns Facebook and Instagram, this had large ramifications across Canada. In response, Meta blocked all news links on their platforms. And then on August 8th, District of Tofino Council requested an impact assessment from staff. So there are a couple examples here at the federal, provincial, and municipal levels of councils taking action on this subject. For example, in the province of BC, the provincial legislature canceled all Facebook and Instagram ads, except in the cases of critical health and safety information. An opposite example is the city of Ottawa, which voted to continue these paid ads, citing if they were to remove ads off Facebook and Instagram, that would perhaps increase the loss of recreation participation, and the council deemed it a federal issue. So those are two examples where council has taken action in the past. To be clear, government communications continue on Meta. It's just the factor of removing a paid campaign on a particular post. And I can get into that in a bit. So the Tofino perspective here, here in Tofino, the district of Tofino spends approximately $1,000 per year on paid ads on Instagram and Facebook. I can give an example of a paid post versus an unpaid post. So on July 6th, we announced our stage 3 water restrictions. This was a significant announcement, got a lot of engagement. It was an unpaid post. So it was shared around, we received 4,762 views on this particular post. It resulted in a 6% decrease in water usage. This, over the next few days, was deemed not enough of a reaction from the community, considering the water situation. So action was taken on those posts to escalate communications. So staff decided to place a spend on that particular post, which more than doubled the engagement and the views. Through this paid ad campaign, we were able to geo-target the peninsula and reach folks not only that followed District of Tofino accounts, but also visitors to the region. This resulted in a 16% decrease in water usage overnight. So a significant impact there. So in that example, council might understand that paid campaigns can reach an audience that is unfamiliar to District of Tofino. Department impact. So throughout this impact assessment, Manager of Legislative Services interviewed several departments that currently or in the past have used paid ads on Meta. And I will just go through the different departments from high impact to low impact. So human resources often employs a paid campaign on a particular job posting. This is in an effort to geo-target or target candidates that may have particular interests or might be more qualified for the particular job that they're posting for. So in that interview, human resources deemed the impact would be high if council were to decide to pull ads from Meta. In community services, was able to approach the manager of community programs, which deemed a medium impact in targeting for recreation programs, events, culture programs, and also grants, community grants. So often that department uses this tool to recruit grant applications. Within emergency preparedness, this was a low impact with the caveat of if there's a crisis or emergency situation, a paid campaign could be useful. Within corporate services, legislative services deemed this would be medium impact. This department handles communications for the District of Tofino. And as pointed out in the water restrictions example, this could have a medium-sized impact on that department. And finally, infrastructure and public works, occasionally for construction or public notices, that department has used this in the past, and a manager deemed this to be a low impact on it. On the right side of the screen there, you'll see an example. So the difference here between an organic post or a paid post is this post would show up on a feed on an account that not necessarily is following District of Tofino accounts. So just a visual example there for you. So no particular recommendation for you tonight, council, but a few options that we suggest could be taking place. So I can read these out if you'd like, or you're able to discuss.
Thank you very much. Maybe we'd like to have some discussion. Everyone's had time to read the options beforehand. All right, Councillor McMaster.
Well, when this first came up, I stated at the time I wasn't a fan of Bill C-18 right from the start. I was interested to see how much the district spent on advertising, and I think we all know that Facebook in particular is a big communication tool in this town. And when I see we're only spending $1,000, I think we should just continue as we are.
Thank you.
And I'm happy to move the motion if nobody else has anything.
Does anyone else have any comments, questions?
I guess I would just comment that I would be happy with the third option there, just because I think $1,000 isn't a significant enough impact for us to do kind of take a grand stance on, for sure. I think it would be detrimental to us to pull that.
I'd like to say that I understand why we're discussing this and the reasoning behind it. However, given that I think we all support transparency and giving out as much information as we can. If we're removing one of those tools, we're not doing anyone a service. So I would also be in support of the third option. Anyone like to read the motion?
Okay, I'll move that staff continue using Meta's paid advertisements to ensure service to the community is met.
Second by Councillor Thomas. Any further discussion? All in favor? Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Item 10.5, multi-use path e-mobility policy report from community services. Is Mr. Vic on screen? All right.
Good afternoon, Acting Mayor and Council. I hope everybody can hear me all right. If you wouldn't mind giving me a thumbs up just to make sure you're all here. Perfect. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen quickly here. Okay, so I'm hoping that everybody's looking at a screen that says MUP, e-mobility regulation policy. I apologize for not being there in person, but hopefully we don't have any technological glitches and the information can come across clearly. So this presentation is related to the e-mobility regulation policy report that is part of the council agenda for this particular meeting. A brief note of background to introduce council to this or reintroduce council to this because it has been a few months since this has been considered. Over the last several years, district staff have received numerous calls and letters from the public regarding, looking for information regarding e-mobility devices on the MUP and also reporting sometimes being a little bit nervous around the use of e-mobility devices on the multi-use path. And in early 2020, in response to this, the District of Tofino began some preliminary work on developing a policy to regulate e-mobility devices on the multi-use path. This was essentially halted due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the work on the project was resumed again in early 2023. There was an initial presentation outlining the direction that council were moving in terms of the policy at a committee of the whole meeting on April 17th of 2023. Since then, the policy has been more formally developed based on our jurisdictional limits, as well as input from council at that committee of the whole meeting, with the goal of providing fairly clear and transparent information regarding our multi-use path permissions and looking to disseminate information via signs and pamphlets and other methods. So a brief note on the jurisdiction of the multi-use path. It's currently under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure. We have a very informal, I would say almost non-existent agreement. They've allowed us to install it there, but we really have no ability to enforce any sort of bylaw on there. This policy is really just intended to allow the district to produce some signage and other informational documents to inform and guide public use of the multi-use path. The policy really just mirrors provincial regulations as we have no real authority to stray from those regulations. However, it's very unlikely that the Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure will be producing or disseminating this information. It's not the easiest thing to find. And in order to support particularly frontline office staff, as well as other users of the multi-use path, and just being able to provide some clear information around how the multi-use path should be used, we're looking to adopt this policy so that we can then produce some signage and information based on the policy. One note is that there's the potential that MOTI may consider transferring jurisdiction to the multi-use path to the District of Tofino. This would then allow us to create our own policy, or a more robust policy, or more specific policy with different regulations and permissions than what we see today, or even look to enact some bylaws if that's appropriate at the time. So the policy, as noted, outlines permissions for how the MUP can be used, and it really does just match provincial regulation or legislations and regulations. Really, the purpose here is to allow the District of Tofino to then take it upon ourselves to create some signage and information and actually put it out there and communicate those regulations. It does apply to all MUP users, with the exception of emergency service providers who are acting in the course of their duties. There's 11 foundational principles to the policy, and these are all taken from existing district documents such as the Vision to Action, Community Plan, Multimodal Transportation Plan, etc. A few highlights that I'd like to point out. Basically, all people-powered modes of transport are permitted. So this is walking, running, typical bicycles, pushing skateboards, pushing scooters, any sort of mode of transportation that does not have a motor of any kind is permitted. Electric bikes are also permitted as long as they have functioning pedals and an electric motor that does not exceed 500 watts and does not exceed a top speed of 32 kilometers per hour. E-mobility devices for those with mobility challenges. So these are things like electric wheelchairs are also permitted. What's prohibited are any sort of gas-powered device, any other type of e-mobility device that's not permitted. So these are things like electric scooters or electric skateboards are not permitted under this policy. Again, this is us mimicking what the province does not permit. So we're already mimicking provincial regulations. Limited speed motorcycles, mopeds, those kinds of things are also not permitted at this time. The policy may change in the future. However, if there are any changes to provincial legislation, I know there are a number of pilot projects for electric scooters out there happening in various communities. This may result in a change to provincial legislation, which we would likely mimic again with the change to this policy if that happens. Or if there's a transfer of jurisdiction to the district, as I've noted, that would then give us the authority to kind of branch off and create our own policy regulations if that's something that's desired at that time. Communications around this, there were several consultation activities that occurred during the early stages of the project. Mostly this was working with local bike shops and rental shops. However, along with the lack of District of Tofino jurisdiction at this time, additional consultation is really considered unnecessary. Again, we're just looking to kind of copy what the province is doing. Additional consultation may be us promising things that we can't deliver on if we say that we can make changes to the policy when we don't really have the jurisdiction to do so. It's also worth noting that should the policy be adopted, there'll be numerous kind of communications efforts. So this will be various social media posts that we'll have prepared. Probably have various signs going up on the multi-use path. That's one of the main kind of thrust, the main point of this exercise, really. Various pamphlets available both at the district office and at local bike shops, and a lot of ongoing monitoring activities to ensure that the policy is at least a little bit effective. And if any changes are necessary, we can be aware of those and act on those should we be able to in the future. So that's the end of my presentation here. The recommendation is up on the screen there. So a couple of the other options would be to adopt the policy with amendments. Staff don't really recommend this unless it's a very small amendment that doesn't interfere with provincial regulations. Again, we don't really have the jurisdiction to. We could adopt a policy that does not mimic provincial regulations, but that would be quite unwise because we really have no jurisdiction to enforce any of those kinds of policies. Or we could deny defer adoption of the policy as well. So staff are supportive of the current recommendation, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
All right, thank you very much. Councillor Steer.
Yeah, thank you through the chair. Thank you, Mr. Tick, for the report. As it turns out, this policy in essence is a communication policy having no jurisdiction and no enforcement abilities. So I'm wondering in your report, and you've alluded to several times, the potential to transfer that jurisdiction to the district via license of occupation. Two things. One, if maybe you could explain, I certainly understand the pros of having that license of occupation. I'm wondering if there are any cons to that. And I'm wondering if those discussions have developed any further than just those preliminary discussions.
Thank you for the question through the chair. I am unaware if those conversations have progressed any further than initial discussions. I've been a little bit stepped away from day-to-day kind of dealings of the district for the past few months. Perhaps the director of community services may have some more information there, but I'm not sure at this point in time. I would say the advantages, as you've noted, are fairly clear. We would just be able to actually take control of that and install our own regulations that most fit Tofino as appropriate over the multi-use path. I would say one of the downsides to jurisdiction is that there may be some liability that we assume, as we assume with any kind of new piece of public infrastructure. We're already very much paying for the maintenance and any creation of new multi-use paths, so there wouldn't be very much change there. But that's something that we would likely, prior to negotiating any license of occupation, that's something that we would look very closely at with both our legal counsel as well as MIABC. But at this point in time, I have no further details for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I know we're trying to mimic multis regulations, but during the rush hour to the WIC, when I'm out walking the dogs, I know or see at least 2 or 3 employees riding kick scooters, electric kick scooters to work. It almost feels ashamed to be saying we're not allowing them on the MUP when they're not allowed on the road or on sidewalks. And I don't actually see that they would cause a problem on the MUP.
If I might direct that maybe to April, are there not pilot communities right now testing out whether or not electric kick scooters will be allowed?
Through the chair, yes, there are a number of communities, Lower Mainland and Interior BC, that have e-mobility or e-scooter pilot projects. That's certainly something that staff can look into applying for if that's something that is of interest to council.
I think I personally would be very interested in that because I feel the same way as Councillor McMaster. I think that they're some of the least hazardous vehicles that I see on the map. All right, any other comments, questions? Good, thank you very much. Oh,
I'll make one quick comment. I think I wouldn't be too anxious to take over jurisdiction and enforcement of the provincial regulations until they're and even making our own regulations. There's some costs and liabilities that go with it that have to be well considered before we do that. And then also because there's things like this pilot project out there, it would be good to wait until some of these things settle out and see what the problems might expand into in terms of prohibitions and permissions. Yeah, I see it almost as a downloading issue if we just jump on it because we want to make different regulations. So that would be my.
all right, thank you very much, Councillor Spear.
To reply to Councillor Anderson's concern. Yeah, my concern only would be that in lieu of anybody being able to enforce whatever those regulations are, that essentially it's a free for all, whether it's downloaded to us or not. And in the interest of public safety and stuff, to be able to enforce bylaws proactively would be my main concern. Just leaving it unenforced because the province isn't going to come in and enforce it, that's for sure. That would be my main reason for looking at that jurisdiction change.
All right, thank you very much. Any further questions? Would anyone like to read the recommendation?
I'll read that the multi-use path e-mobility regulation policy is shown as Appendix 1 in the staff report titled Multi-Use Path e-mobility regulation policy dated September 12, 2023 be adopted.
All right, I'll second that. All in favor? Any further comments? All right, all in favor? Unanimous? Okay. All right, item 10.6. I am declaring a conflict of interest on this agenda item, as my future employment has an interest in this application. So I'm going to recuse myself, and Councillor Steer will be stepping in.
And I'll take a point of privilege and call for a 2-minute recess so I can use the facilities.
There you go.
Item 10.6, official community plan amendment staff accommodation development within the ocean interface designation. Motion to proceed and a report from community services.
Thank you, Councillor Steer. This one's me again, and I will be sharing my screen for another brief presentation. Okay, so I'm hoping that the screen now shows OCP amendment staff accommodation in the ocean interface designation.
It does.
Thank you. I will try to keep this presentation relatively brief, as I'm sure there may be some discussion and questions, but this is not a application that comes before council very regularly, so it's worth spending a few minutes just kind of outlining it and then going over a few of the background elements. So by way of introduction, this OCP amendment application actually came about following the receipt of a couple of zoning amendment applications. They were received for properties within the Ocean Interface OCP designation, and they were looking to essentially rezone those properties to allow staff accommodation. Staff accommodation was not a current permitted use on those particular properties. The general OCP policies have some fairly strong language that suggests that no development should be permitted in this designation. In fact, it essentially the OCP restricts development to the village, future homes, and industrial way areas currently. That's basically the growth containment boundary downtown area of the District of Tofino. However, we do have many other policies within the OCP and our other guiding documents that are supportive of this type of development. Essentially, it's a private developer coming in, looking to create staff accommodation, which could be construed as affordable housing. So following a little bit of a more comprehensive review of these zoning amendment applications, an OCP amendment was deemed necessary to appropriately consider these applications. Provincial legislation, the Local Government Act, requires that once an OCP is adopted, or whichever OCP is currently in force in a municipality, all bylaws and works that are considered and enacted following the adoption of that OCP have to be quote unquote consistent with the OCP. And so allowing development in an area that is specifically disallowed development is not being consistent with the OCP. Following a request for an OCP amendment, there was, an OCP amendment application. The application was subsequently received. So just to sort of orient council, these two maps show the ocean interface designation locations. It's the blue area on the maps. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the area around Mackenzie Beach, sort of Hellison Drive is centered there. And the right-hand side shows the area around Cox Bay. So these are our kind of resort districts, if you will, and that's what the Ocean Interface OCP designation is meant to both regulate and facilitate is the development largely of resort accommodation. These aren't intended to necessarily be residential or commercial areas. I should say commercial accommodation areas, not necessarily retail commercial or other types of commercial areas. I also wanted to touch briefly on the, kind of what it means to amend an OCP. Again, this is a little bit different than amending another bylaw. As we're, I'm sure, all quite familiar at this point, the OCP, the Official Community Plan, is our guiding document for land use. It's a fairly high-level document, but it considers large areas of the community and roughly talks about what we want to see in those areas of the community and where we want the land development of the community to go at quite a high level. So amending the OCP is, of course, possible. It's what we would call a living document, and it really follows roughly the same process as zoning amendments, but there are a few different considerations and a few other process steps that need to be considered. Just kind of again, by way of background, typically if a zoning amendment comes forward to staff and the applicant really wants it to go forward to council and it does not line up with the OCP, staff would recommend denying the application, again, because provincial legislation requires us to ensure that any zoning or any other bylaws that are enacted following the adoption of an OCP are consistent with that OCP. Typically, these kinds of applications don't even make it to council. They come first to staff, and staff inform the applicant that staff will be unable to support the application, and then they usually revise the application so that it is consistent with the OCP and can receive support from staff. However, on occasion, a proposal does come forward that is not consistent with the OCP, but also fulfills a noted community need or is otherwise worthy of consideration. Maybe it's supported by many other OCP policies. This is sort of the case here, and this is why we're actually bringing forward an OCP amendment application for council to consider. Really what the applicant is putting forward is something that is well supported within our OCP. It's just not in the place that we would like to see it. So it may be worthy to consider amending the OCP to think about potentially facilitating this type of development. So a little bit more on amending an OCP. An OCP amendment is really, it's a bylaw amendment. The OCP is a bylaw and requires 4 readings. However, we must hold a public hearing that cannot be waived or skipped in any way. And we also have to hold an additional, what is quote unquote called an appropriate form of public consultation. Typically with a full OCP review or overhaul, we have numerous public consultation activities. These often take the form of everything from an online survey to information meetings to open houses, steering committees, all those kinds of things. That's usually what we look at for a much larger overhaul of the OCP that takes sometimes years. An OCP amendment also impacts a wider area than a zoning change. Usually when we bring rezoning applications to council, it's for a particular property and for a particular development on that property. However, an OCP change might impact an entire designation, as is the case here, or the entire community. The amendments that are the OCP amendment, pardon me, that is currently under consideration, it's worth noting that it would likely be addressed during some sort of a more routine OCP update or redo, which we're hoping to do every 3 to 5 years. But it is being considered now due to the receipt of a specific application. The reason that we would be considering it during a more routine OCP update is that it is a fairly unclear part of the OCP. The language is not very clear. Certain policies in the OCP would be very supportive of this zoning amendment, including policies within the ocean interface designation itself. However, there are some general policies that seem to just prohibit it. So on balance, it appears that the OCP is saying we should not be considering this type of development. However, there is language within the OCP that is also very supportive of it. So due to that kind of lack of clarity, this is something that we would be looking to clean up in more of a housekeeping OCP update or redo, but that may not happen for another couple of years at this point. And the applicant is looking to potentially move forward with these developments a little bit more sooner. So that's why we're considering it at this point. The proposal, as I've noted, the OCP does not permit development outside of the village, future homes, and industrial way designations. The 2 zoning amendments that we currently have in our queue would like to allow staff accommodation development within the ocean interface designation. So many of the properties within the ocean interface designation have zoning, commercial zoning that allow resorts. That zoning does allow, as part of the permissions, it does actually allow staff accommodation to be built. However, the properties in question have more of a large rural residential zone on them, so they would need to be rezoned to allow higher density staff accommodation. That rezoning then is kind of going against our OCP, which calls for this OCP amendment. So there are very specific policies within the ocean interface and other OCP policies that do support these zoning amendments. However, they are somewhat negated by the overarching language that prohibits development in the area. It's also worth noting that there's no other changes that would be considered. This isn't opening up areas of the community for more dense residential or other commercial developments. Really, we're just thinking about allowing staff accommodation specifically within the ocean interface designation specifically, which is already a designation that we're looking at, where we would, if we were to be supportive of resort development, that would be kind of where we would like it to be. I also just want to briefly touch on the related zoning amendments. One is already familiar to council. So there are 2 active zoning amendment applications that would be impacted by this OCP amendment. I apologize, that should say OCP amendment on the first bullet there. One is for 1211 Pacific Rim Highway. That's almost directly across from Sharp Road and would allow, I think, a 25-unit dedicated staff accommodation for the Q&amp Inn. So this is on the property that's adjacent to the Q&amp Inn. It is not commercially zoned currently. I believe it's zoned A3 at the moment. So it's a large lot, low density residential zone. They would need to rezone, and in order to rezone, we need to amend the OCP to permit that rezoning. And the other is for a general staff accommodation and development at 1141 Pacific Rim Highway. This is the Crabapple property, or what was formerly known as the Crabapple property. Council have already seen a zoning amendment application for this property, and it was deferred. At that point, staff brought it forward for permission to proceed and outlined some issues in the OCP, and we're looking to kind of work through those issues as we drafted a bylaw. It would likely have come up as we were looking to draft the bylaw that application would have required an OCP amendment as well. It just wasn't brought forward at that time. However, council looked to defer that application at that time. And after working with the applicant a little bit more on their proposal, it's also become clear that they need to work with essentially the same OCP amendment. So the application itself was received from the applicant for 1211 Pacific Rim Highway. That's the Q&amp staff comm. However, it would also facilitate the 1141, that's the Crabapple development application as well. It's also worth noting that council is, of course, not obliged to approve either application, even if the OCP amendment is approved. So an OCP amendment of this nature would just essentially allow these applications to be considered. It would not grant any sort of other approval to those specific zoning applications. Again, we're just amending the OCP at this point. It's not facilitating, or it's not allowing any particular development. However, it does facilitate the consideration of those developments in a legal context. I also wanted to touch briefly on the consultation plan. So most planning considerations are actually dealt with through the zoning amendment process because that's very specific to the actual development and the specific property. So these are things like servicing and traffic. However, consultation is an important part of the OCP amendment. Public hearing is required, as I've noted, along with at least one additional adequate opportunity for public consultation. So at this point, because it's a fairly minor amendment that we're proposing, it's really a matter of clarifying some language. We're not overhauling the whole OCP. Staff are proposing that just a single public information meeting held prior to first reading, along with the public hearing and the full referral process, should be adequate for consultation for this particular application. Again, this is not a significant change in the OCP. It's not a major change to development policy within the district, and it's really looking to provide clarity and better transparency for current and future developers. I would note that there are numerous other properties within the ocean interface designation that are not currently zoned commercial, and that this may open the door for more applications for staff accommodation in that area. Again, council is under no obligation to approve those applications, and they will be dealt with one at a time as they come through the door, essentially. So looking at the next steps of this application, should we decide to move forward with permission to proceed today, there will be a full referral to related agencies as well as First Nations, neighboring local governments, the school district. It's a little bit more of a robust referral than a smaller zoning amendment would be. We would then look to draft the bylaw which is, considering the specific language changes, there'd be particular policies that we would essentially just change small parts of the language and really soften the language as opposed to use the very specific kind of prohibitive language that's currently there. And then we would also look to hold a public information meeting, and following all that, we would bring it back to council for consideration of first reading. It's also worth noting that all the other sort of considerations around development within this area that are outlined in the OCP, these are things like traffic and flooding and services and all those kinds of things would form an important part of the application. So just because we are basically considering allowing ourselves to consider development in this area doesn't mean that any of those other requirements are going to be brushed under the rug in any way. The only other note that I'd like to make is that the related zoning amendments will likely be introduced or reintroduced, as the case may be, at some point during this time. So that means we will be considering these applications concurrently instead of consecutively. What will likely happen is that we'll run the OCP process slightly ahead of the zoning process. And so by the time we adopt the OCP, if that's the way that this goes, we'll be getting close to adopting the zoning amendments as well. So the recommendation is up on the screen there. The other options would be to refuse or deny the application or defer the application if that's the direction council would like to go today, if there's more information that's needed. So I will stop talking at that point, but I'm guessing there might be a couple questions and I'm happy to answer them. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Peter. And I'll look to the councillor if there are questions, and I just got maybe just questions for staff at this point. We can debate when we have the motion on the table. Councillor Anderson.
It might be jumping way ahead to even ask this question, but would we be developing a definition of what staff accommodation is as we go through this process, if it's supported by council to move forward? I'm just a bunch of questions around density and what is staff housing and is and what and the nature of rental housing in general sort of comes into the picture. I know the province allows now for specific zoning to be rental designation. So a bunch of questions come in, but I guess back to my main question, are we going to in this process define what staff accommodation is?
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Councillor Anderson. I believe in our zoning bylaw, we do have a brief, may not be adequate definition of staff accommodation, so we would likely look to copy that, but if necessary, we would come up with a definition of staff accommodation. It would also be likely that through the zoning amendment process, we would look to ensure that there are housing agreements associated with these developments. Those housing agreements would likely not include rent caps, as we have included previously on THC projects, but because these are projects being brought forward by a private developer, they would likely be ensuring that the whatever units are constructed are they're unable to be stratified or sold off. They're to be rental housing only, and they would only be permitted to be rented to those who can prove that they have employment by a business holding a business license within the District of Tofino. So I don't have a specific definition for staff accommodation, but it would look something like that. These are designed not as luxury rental units or as luxury condos to be stratified and sold off, but it is to be purpose-built rental accommodation specifically for those living and working within the District of Tofino, and a lot of it would look like housing for seasonal workers as much as year-round workers is kind of what I'm thinking at this point in time.
Okay, that satisfies my questions. Yeah.
Any other questions from council? I just have a quick one, and bear with me, see if I can articulate this in a way. You alluded to it right near the end in terms of the two applicants for their zoning amendments. So it could go concurrently in the expediency of time. So if the OCP amendment was to proceed and be successful, they could be with the potential for them to be at least to a third reading before an adoption pending the successful outcome of an OCP amendment.
Thank you for the question. Typically, this is upon my conversations with our lawyers in the last little while. Typically, what happens is in this sort of a situation, it's not recommended to go through a public hearing. If a zoning bylaw is not lining up with an OCP amendment, it's not recommended to go through a public hearing for the zoning bylaw prior to adoption of the OCP amendment. So it would likely be that we bring, if the applications continue to be supported, we would likely bring the zoning amendments up to perhaps second reading if a public hearing was being held, or potentially third reading. From a legal perspective, my understanding is we can do everything except adopt the zoning bylaw prior to the OCP bylaw being adopted. But from just a process standpoint, we would likely bring it forward to the public hearing and then wait for the OCP amendment to be adopted if it hadn't been at that point, and then proceed further with the zoning amendments as required, just to make sure that we're complying with all provincial legislation, outlines and regulations.
Thank you. Seeing no further questions from council, would somebody like to read the recommended motion?
I'll read it. I move that staff proceed with further review of an official community plan amendment to clarify policies regarding staff accommodation development within the ocean interface designation.
And I'll look for comment or debate from council. Councillor Anderson. Oh, no, you were just seconding.
I was seconding.
Okay, great.
I have a comment too, but Councillor McMaster.
Councillor McMaster.
Firstly.
Yeah, I don't take amendments to the OCP lightly. I hope the rest of council is the same. Yeah, I recognise the need for housing, but I've always viewed one of the strong words in the OCP is community. So if there were to be a change to the OCP, I would like to see it benefit the community. So when I see words in the slides that you presented dedicated to a certain section, that sort of rankles a little bit. So that's all I'd like to say.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I think that recognizing the acute need for housing and staff accommodation, as well as all types of rental housing. I'm glad that we're looking at the ways of providing that and allowing for that through potential official community plan amendment. I'm kind of interested in this being a little more open to all sectors, including anybody that might be providing housing. So I'd be keen on not only having it restricted to businesses. It should be possible for non-government organizations and any sectors that might be providing housing to work within our OCP and maybe fit into this area should should we agree with it? I think one of the another comment I have is that I think as we looked at our OCP, that this tsunami zone was a big consideration in sort of restricting development in this area, having high density in that whole tsunami zone is putting people at risk in a potential evacuation scenario. So I'd be interested to know if and to hear more about ways we might mitigate some of those risks by tsunami evacuation plans maybe becoming part of a requirement if we do go to higher densities, and maybe alternative forms of transportation being incorporated into I don't know if it can be incorporated into zoning regulation, but into the planning for these areas, so that people aren't all expected to be able to get on the highway in a vehicle at once when we only have one road. So I think in consideration as we go through this, that's one of the things that may need to be addressed. And like certainly was a consideration in when we looked at favoring development outside of the tsunami zone. So that's something I would be interested in learning more about and considering as we go through this process.
I think for me, I feel like I understand the desire to have this amendment, especially for these two properties. But for me, I feel like the OCP was set up to have high density downtown, and now we're going to be looking at putting it outside of town. So then to me, I see like that leads a potential to have high density everywhere. And I have a hard time with that. And yeah, so I think that's something that brings me concern with this.
I get the gravity of making amendments to the OCP, but I feel very supportive of this, and I feel pretty safe in the fact that we've been assured that things will come across our table. It doesn't necessarily open the door that everybody will kind of get to do what they want. We'll still be able to be presented with these things. And I understand these areas, one of them is already quite populated, and one of them is being built, purpose-built for a business that will be walking distance for people who will be living there, which is actually quite encouraging for alternative transportation. But yeah, so I'm supportive of this. All right.
So I am supportive of this permission to proceed at this point, and to Councillor McMaster's point around taking the OCP seriously. It is a serious consideration, and as staff has pointed out, this is not so much a policy shift as a clarification, and I would agree with that assessment. The other part of the that Councillor Anderson has brought up has been a concern about putting density in areas of potential tsunami. And there has been discussion in the previous zoning amendment that had been brought forward around potential mitigation issues around that. It is certainly a concern that has to be considered in this application when we are putting densities in a known tsunami risk area. So that's something certainly to be considered within that application. I do see some community benefits outside of just the potential for housing staff, which certainly has a benefit for the businesses, but I do see some community benefit outside of that very specific area in terms of the potential for freeing up potential housing from existing housing stock that be able to move short-term workers into that type of short-term housing that the applicants would be providing. And then the other part of that, it could potentially, not understanding at this point what those potential staffing accommodations would look like or what they consist of, there is potential for those to be year-round accommodation in a market that we know is severely limited for those people. So in essence, I am supportive of the permission to proceed, and I think staff have heard some of those concerns from council to move forward. So at this point, I'll call the question on the motion that's on the table. All in favor? Seeing none in opposition, motion carried. I'll go grab our. Oh, yeah, thank you.
All right. So item 11, business initiated by council members. Councillor Sloan.
I would like to serve notice of my intent to serve notice of motion at the regular council meeting on October 10th. My motion will be regarding the incentivization of the use of rainwater and recycled water in buildings.
Awesome. And I don't believe we need to do anything. Thank you for listening. And then we have 11.1 committee and external appointment verbal reports from council members. That was there anything else? Yep. Business. Nope. Question period. Mr. Shortall, do we have any submissions?
Currently, no submissions. Acting Mayor Sawyer, I'll do a call again. If anyone would like to ask a question of council, they can do so now. If you're in the public, let me know. If you're online via Zoom, you can use the question and answer function via Zoom. Raise your hand, I'll permit you to speak. So we'll calling once, calling twice, calling 3 times, and no questions at this point. Acting Mayor Sawyer.
All right. Thank you very much. So now I am going to move the recommendation that the meeting be closed to the public pursuant to sections 90 of the community charter to discuss matters relating to 1A, personal information about an identifiable individual who holds or is being considered for a position as an officer, employee, or agent of the municipality, or another position appointed by the municipality. 1C, labor relations or other employee relations. 1L, discussion with municipal officers and employees respecting municipal objectives, measures, and progress reports for the purpose of preparing an annual report under section 98. Annual municipal report. 2B, the consideration of information received and held in confidence related to negotiations between the municipality and a provincial government or the federal government or both, or between a provincial government or the federal government or both and a third party. Seconded by Councillor Thomas. All in favor? All right. We're going to post it.